It's never good news when word goes out that the Special Investigations Unit, the SIU, has been deployed. It means that there's been police involvement in harm or death to civilians. Lately, something that's been in the headlines too often for anyone's liking. And for many observers, it remains unclear how well those investigations hold police accountable for their actions. Joining us now for more, two lawyers are acutely tuned to this conversation. Ian Scott, who was director of Ontario's Special Investigations Unit from 2008 to 2013. And Shakir Rahim, director of the Criminal Justice Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for being here, because just this week alone in this province, the SIU has been called a couple times. And as I said, this is not something that any one of us want to hear, but it's important for us to talk about it. Ian, I'd like to start with you. Sure. The Special Investigations Unit, referred to as the SIU, is an agency that oversees the police in this province. You were the director for the SIU. When does the SIU step in to investigate police conduct?
It steps in when on-duty police officers are involved in incidents that lead to either death, serious injury, or allegations of sexual assault. And its mandate is solely criminal. It's not involved in disciplinary matters. So the objective is to do a thorough and independent investigation where decisions made by the director, who was me for 5 years, made a decision as to whether or not criminal charges should be laid. And in the vast majority of cases, there were no criminal charges laid. But, and over the years, the process has changed. But now, as a result, really, as a result of the new act that came into force in 2020, the Special Investigations Unit Act, all of the investigations are reported out on in public reporting. So it can be picked up at the SIU website, and many of the media pick up when there is no charges laid. And it's up to the director to write really reasons as to why no charges are laid and give some background. In the few cases, and when I was there, I'm not sure if the stats have changed on this, approximately 10 to 12 criminal charges were laid a year. Those charges go into the criminal justice system, and the public accountability aspect of that relates to the criminal justice system, which, if it goes to trial, will lead to a very public airing, where
we'll get to that in a
the
second.
media is involved.
We'll get to that in a second, but I have two follow-ups to what you just said. One, you mentioned on-duty police officers.
Correct.
So I'm guessing it doesn't apply to off-duty police officers?
Generally not, although surprisingly, I'm not sure if the SIU was involved in one. There's an officer charged with manslaughter right now, but I don't think the SIU did the investigation. And typically they don't. They're involved in the on-duty matters. Okay,
and the other follow-up that I wanted to know is the SIU Independent?
Well, I think it is. I mean, and the new act has entrenched more independence by, first of all, having a separate standalone act as opposed to part of the prior act, which is called the Police Services Act. The director now is an ordinary counsel for a 5-year renewable term, which means that for that 5-year period, it'd be very, very difficult to get rid of them. My personal view is they should take the next step, and they should make it an office of the legislature, much like, say, the ombudsman or the privacy commissioner.
So there's no partisanship or anything like that?
Yeah, there's no possibility of political interference. I mean, when I was there, basically I was left to my own. The government didn't really want to have a whole lot to do with me when I was there for my 5 years.
We'll get into that for just a second. But Shakir, I don't know if a lot of people understand what the mandate of the SIU is. For me, I thought that it was made up of all former police officers. The structure of the SIU includes investigators, some of which were formerly police officers. There has been criticism in the past of having officers investigating other officers. What's your view?
Well, I think there has been a clear concern from communities that are disproportionately affected by police violence that having former police officers comprise the majority of the SIU's investigators is an issue for them. And a few years ago, there was a report that was commissioned by the government and conducted by Justice Michael Tulloch, who's now the Chief Justice of Ontario. And in that report at the time in 2017, 67% of the investigators of the SIU were former police officers. And so it does remain an issue for a lot of communities affected by police violence that there isn't a more diverse set of investigative backgrounds represented on the SIU's investigating
Which
force.
communities are you talking about?
We're talking about the Black community, the Indigenous community, and the different intersections that exist there as well. So people who may have mental health issues and other groups that disproportionately come into contact with police.
Is that a fair criticism, Ian?
Well, it's a
Or concern, perhaps?
well, it's a vexing issue because for the first 10 years of the SIU's existence, the big attack was it was incompetent. It couldn't do these investigations. We have to remember we're looking at, in some cases, homicide investigations. For example, in the Sammy Yatim case, where I laid that charge, that ended up being a murder case.
Can you let us know, remind us what the Sammy Yatim case was?
The Sammy Yatim case was the fellow who was shot on the streetcar in Toronto in 2013.
He was young, too. I think he was 18 or something?
Yeah, I believe it. Yes, I think he was about 18 or 19, by a Toronto police officer named James Forcillo. He was ultimately convicted of attempted murder. But if these are going to go to trial, they have to withstand the scrutiny that'll exist in a courtroom. So where do you get those kind of skills? Well, you know, the natural basis for those kind of skills are people that have that kind of prior experience. It's difficult to find outside of the policing community. So over time, I think what has happened is there has been training of those that do not have a police background. And right now, I believe in the SIU, there are 16 full-time investigators. 10 do not have a policing background. Or sorry, 10 do have 10 do not have a policing background. 6 do. Now, there are other groups in the SIU that are involved in investigations, forensics, for example. They're almost all former police officers because it's very, very difficult to get that kind of training. You can train people over time, which is ultimately what the SIU has done over a period of 30-odd years.
But training aside, I think the concern might be that how do you investigate people, like you were doing the same job?
Yes.
I don't want to use the word bias, but maybe you might not judge them as harshly as other people. People dying might be, maybe there's a perception, there should be a perception that if someone dies, there should be, a police officer should be held to a higher scrutiny than the regular public, no?
Well, it's a fair comment that there's the perception of bias in those circumstances, but I think ultimately what you need is a mix here. You need a mix of competence as well as community representatives. And certainly when I was there, I was trying to encourage that. There were full-time investigators being hired when I was there, and I made an effort to make sure that they came from a non-policing background. But it takes time. It takes time to be integrated into that system, and you do need, at least we have up to this point, maybe in another generation, we can have a complete non-policing investigators who can do these kind of criminal investigations, but it just doesn't exist at this point in time. Now, we also have to remember that ultimately all decisions there are reviewed by a director who, in my case, I'm a lawyer by background, and the history of the SIU has been virtually entirely that they've been either lawyers or former judges that have been the directors of the SIU, and those people by statute cannot have a police background.
Well, you know, you talked about training. We've heard that in recent years, police have had more training. There's more ways to hold them accountable with body cameras. But I just wanted, there's a new report that says that in the last 3 years, fatal police shootings, deaths have risen from 34 in 2019 to 69 last year, the highest on record. So if there is more training, there is more knowledge, there is more awareness, why is it getting worse? Ian, Shakir, I want to hear from you.
Sure. Well, Nam, I think one of the issues is that there is an absence of that training being perceived as and actually being effective. So in the past several years, there have been a number of reports and inquiries that have examined this issue of do the police effectively use de-escalation tactics? Do the police respond appropriately to people experiencing mental health issues? The Toronto Police Service conducted a review by former Supreme Court Justice Frank Iacobucci. There was an inquest after the police shooting of Andrew Loku, where charges were not laid by the SIU, who was a person who was experiencing mental health issues. And these reports have repeatedly found that there is an urgent need to improve the use of de-escalation and training of how the police deal with people in mental health crises. So there's a long way to go, I would say, before we can really say the police are acting with the necessary competence to deal with those kinds of situations. And later on, I'm happy to speak a little bit about how I think that issue also fits into the lack of public confidence in the SIU as it relates to some of its charging decisions.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but I wanted to give the audience and for us to get a better understanding of how many cases we are talking about. There have been some changes to the SIU since it was created in 1990. It now publicly, as you mentioned, posts its investigations and charges. Let's bring in these numbers. In 2022, there were 333 cases being investigated. 279 were closed, and in 6 cases, charges were laid. In 2021, there were 431 cases, so 2022, it seems as if it got a little bit better. But in 2021, 405 of those cases were closed and 13 charges were laid. Ian, coming back to you on this one, the charges in these cases also include custodial injury to sexual assault allegations. When we talk about public confidence, from an outside perspective, the number of charges seems low compared to the number of investigations. Why is the rate of charges so low?
Well, I think the rate is low because of the mandate of policing. And policing, by its very nature, is involved in the non-consensual use of force. These are the group that we expect in our society to enforce the law.
But we should also hold them to a higher responsibility, no?
Well, indeed, we should hold them to a thorough and independent investigation. In terms of the criminal context, and we have to remember the SIU's mandate is solely criminal. It's not disciplinary, it's not misconduct, and it's not training. These are issues which can, I think, be very important in terms of reducing the number of incidents involving serious injury and death. But when they happen, and indeed they do happen, as we see from those stats, the SIU's mandate is to do that thorough independent investigation and determine whether or not criminal charges should be laid as a result. Now, the standard for criminal charges doesn't vary. You can be, it doesn't matter who you are. The standard for the laying of charges is reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offense took place. I'm personally of the view that we ought not to tinker or tamper with the standard of the laying of criminal charges. Even if you decide you're going to lay more charges against police officers because you want a higher degree of scrutiny within the criminal courts, it's simply not going to work when it goes into the criminal justice system. You have prosecutors going to review cases before they go to trial. And then if they do go to trial, you've got judges and juries who are going to be instructed on the law and told that the law does not apply in situations where the charge should not have been laid in the first place. So the standard is reasonable grounds. That's the sort of filter that all of these have to go through. And as a result, with the review, or what the SIU does after their investigation, and this is really up to the director, to look at this and apply their knowledge of the law in these circumstances. And over again, certainly in the area of serious injury and death, not really in the area of allegations of sexual assault, it kind of fits into a different category, but serious injury and death, you're really dealing with the issue of sometimes a difficult line between what's reasonable and excessive use of force.
Well, I mean, because I think when we all want justice, right? But what you just explained was that even if these charges are brought forward, the process, I guess, the red tape might also end up with the same conclusion. Shakir, those numbers, when you look at 2023, 333 cases investigated, 6 cases charges were laid, only 6. In 2021, 431 cases, 13 charges were laid. When we talk about public confidence, how do you think the public or different communities perceive the number of charges?
Well, I think there is a disconnect between some SIU charging decisions and public perception of what the correct outcome should be. And I do agree with Ian that it's important that we apply the appropriate standard for bringing criminal charges. However, the devil is in the details, right? So in many of these cases, there's a part of the criminal code, that's the document that lays out all the criminal offenses in Canada, that talks about how police are allowed to use force in certain circumstances when they're exercising their duties that otherwise would not be permitted. The use of that force has to be reasonably necessary in the circumstances. Now, the question becomes, how do you determine what was reasonably necessary, right? And so it's the SIU director that is leading that determination, but we know that different people apprised of the same set of facts might arrive at different conclusions on that, and particularly if they have differing views about how much the police have to de-escalate.
So you're saying it's subjective?
Of course, there's an element of subjectivity, but in terms of thinking about, is the SIU incorporating enough thought into that determination around de-escalation, around race, around how the police should interact with someone who's experiencing a mental health crisis? Those are factors that are going to affect how you ultimately decide whether force was reasonable in the circumstances or not. And if I may just highlight 2 things from that independent oversight review I mentioned earlier. There were 2 conclusions in that review that I think pertain exactly to this issue. One was that the SIU does not have enough social and cultural competence when it comes to dealing with certain communities. So for example, those who do have mental health issues or those who do have increased contact with the police. And 2, that the SIU director themselves has not been a position that's reflected racial diversity or professional diversity. In fact, one of the conclusions in that report is that because of the background of the director as a Crown attorney or prosecutor, it may raise concerns about bias since they've spent their entire careers working with police officers. Now, that's not me being here to impugn anyone's integrity or motivations, but rather just to say that there are real issues and questions around the expertise the SIU brings to these conclusions and whether they're informed by the right kinds of backgrounds and issues that result in those determinations.
Well, Ian, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, sure. I mean, these are legitimate concerns, and certainly when I was there, we had 3 or 4 training sessions a year where we brought in all kinds of experts from various communities to talk to the investigators and the larger SIU staff about these issues. And indeed, I mean, I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school to say I'm not a member of a visible minority community. But at the end of the day, these investigations have to go into the criminal justice system if charges are laid. There are a lot of factors here. But let's look once again at the mandate of the SIU. The mandate is criminal. There are many, many issues which need to be addressed within the policing community. And I agree with my friend here. De-escalation, particularly in the area of mental health issues, is a very serious issue. Obviously, the stats are very clear that there's a disproportionate amount of force used against certain visible minority groups. That's not going to, that in itself is something that's virtually indisputable. But it doesn't necessarily cash out on the way you do a criminal investigation. Now, let's just look at one example here. It's kind of a laboratory test. It's really interesting, actually. The one, I did lay, I think, 2 or 3 homicide-related charges when I was there, but the one that went to trial, the one that everybody knows about, is the Sammy Yatim case. I laid a second-degree murder charge. In my view, the force used there, all of it, was unnecessary. It goes to the criminal justice system. What does the jury decide at the end of it? It was attempt murder. It wasn't murder. And I think, the general view of the legal community was that the first shots fired at Sammy Yatim when he was standing at the top of the stairs of a streetcar with a knife in his hand, the jury acquitted on those, and therefore it wasn't murder. They only convicted of the attempt murder when he was literally in a prone position and bullets were being fired into his body. Now, when you start to sort of factor that, you have to go backwards a little bit and start to look at the various parts of the system. It makes you realize the degree of scrutiny that charges that are laid by the SIU go through in the criminal justice system. So I'm not troubled by the decisions I made in terms of reasonable grounds when I was there. I think it's important, though, for any director who's there to consider the bigger picture of the criminal justice system.
Understood, but I think I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question. Because, again, we're talking about process and procedure.
Indeed.
But with certain communities, it's not a feeling, it's the data backs it up, right?
It does.
We do have the data to back it up. A recent report showed that Black and Indigenous people accounted for 25% of the fatal police shootings where the race of the victim was known. So, you know, moving beyond, I guess, the procedure part of it, isn't it important to, if you are investigating these crimes against certain, that are being committed against certain communities, alleged crimes?
Yes.
Isn't it important to acknowledge that bias could lead to someone losing their life?
Yes, it should be acknowledged. However, how that cashes out in terms of evidence that goes into the criminal justice trial is a very vexing issue. And it's one that the SIU in itself cannot address in its entirety.
Then what do you need?
Well, what you need is, you've got to go backwards. You've got to go back into looking at policing in a much more generalized sense before you get to one of the ultimate forms of accountability, which in our society is a criminal justice system.
Well, let me ask Shakir the same question. If the SIU aren't able to do the function that they're supposed to do for certain communities, I hope I'm not saying it in the wrong way, then what else is needed? What else is needed? What's the missing piece?
Yeah,
I guess that's what I want
I think first it's important to remember the SIU emerged in part because of the calls of those communities. So when we think about who the SIU is serving and why, and we think about the role of the criminal justice system, it's important that we don't forget who called for its creation and who's continued to put pressure on the organization to fulfill that mandate. I don't think that there is a inherent inability to find the place in procedure in all of these standards to ensure that there is accountability. Let me give you some very concrete examples. Maybe it's the case that when the SIU director is making this determination that there is more active involvement in consultation with subject matter experts in de-escalation, race, and mental health to inform charging decisions. Maybe some of those considerations and consultations could be reflected in the report that the SIU director issues. Maybe when there are cases where there isn't a charge laid and there is significant community uproar, there's better communication and dialogue with affected communities to understand their perspectives. Maybe in the number of different inquests, reports, recommendations that have come out, there's explicit considerations of recommendations that have been made specific to what constitutes a reasonable and appropriate use of force. So there is an ability within procedure, within the standards of the criminal justice system, to ensure that these issues are appropriately reflected and acted upon. And that's a recognition made by our own courts. Our own courts, in several decisions in the past few years, have made a more explicit recognition of the role of systemic racism in interactions between police and persons who are suspects of crime, of its relevance in examining police conduct. So in a way, the public consciousness is finally catching up to a degree to what communities have been saying all along. It is not an either-or question. It's how do we ensure that the system is in fact serving all of the communities that it is supposed to serve.
I should also just point out, just in issues of fairness, the Toronto Police Chief last year did acknowledge the discrepancies and how I think the data showed that between the years of 2013 and 2017, Black people in Toronto were nearly 20 times more likely to be fatally shot by police than white people. And the Toronto Police Chief at the time apologized to the community for that. We're running out of time. I have so many questions. So let's just keep our questions really short. I mean, I'll keep my questions short. But Ian, I want to move on because I know you wanted to respond to that. But I'm just going to move on to the next question.
Yes.
When the SIU is conducting its investigations, there have been some criticism that officers have the right to remain silent, considering the circumstances that an officer is permitted to use a certain level of force. Should that right be waived?
Well, let's be careful here. We have to break the categories into the subject officer and the witness officers.
What does that mean? What's the difference?
The subject officer is the one who, I'm trying to distill things down, used force, shot the gun. They're the subject officer. They are facing potential criminal charges. Witness officers are basically anybody else, all the witnesses at the scene. The witness officers are duty-bound to write up their notes independently and provide their notes to the SIU, and they are compelled to give statements. But they're not under any criminal jeopardy. The subject officer is potentially under criminal jeopardy. And it's a long-standing concept in British common law jurisprudence that you do not have to incriminate yourself. You are not compelled to give evidence against yourself.
But what if the evidence gives a bigger picture of what happened?
Well, the evidence may well give a bigger picture. I mean, every police officer who's ever done an investigation would love to hear from suspects and the accused. But I mean, I've done defense work. My first advice is don't speak to the police. And because the criminal justice system serves more than one purpose. It's not merely a truth-seeking vehicle. It is in large part that, but it's also one that protects the rights of individuals. And if you want a truth-seeking vehicle, look at inquests or royal inquiries, where anybody can be called, anybody can be compelled to give evidence. But the problem is, and this has been an ongoing issue with the SIU, I personally am of the view that subject officers should not have to be compelled to give evidence or a statement to the SIU. If they give a compelled statement, my view is that no judge is going to accept it as evidence in a trial because it violates the rule against self-incrimination. So what's the point of having the evidence at all? You can't really assess it when you're going to lay a charge. You can't factor it into the equation. It's inadmissible. And right now, subject officers do come in, not all of them, but some do come in. These are voluntary statements, and they could be used in a criminal trial against them. And in fact, I was involved in a case where that happened.
Well, Shakir, how can we have an honest conversation about what's happening in policing because there seems to be this societal response that the police are beyond reproach and if they don't have to testify. How can we explore real solutions to make it better if there's a perception that the actions of police shouldn't be questioned?
Well, one of the initiatives that the CCLA has actually been advocating for a very long time is ensuring that there are more proactive measures in auditing police conduct and practices. And what I mean by that is once an incident has reached the SIU, force has already been used. Somebody is already injured, right? And that also relies, of course, on that matter being reported up effectively. What the Ontario Human Rights Commission, for example, has done recently is done audits of police practices over a period of time, like I think from the report or statistic you cited, perhaps, to ensure that we're catching patterns, practices, conduct before they lead to that ultimate incident where force is employed. So I think there is a need, whether it's through existing bodies or an independent audit body, for an entity to be actively examining when the police are using force, how that force was used, these issues of race, mental health, and others, and ensuring that problematic conduct is identified before there's a death, before we need another inquiry, before we have another report. I think that's of critical importance, and ensuring that police forces cooperate with those initiatives.
Well, Ian, I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds. What would happen if we didn't have the SIU? Well,
you go back to what it was like before 1990. It would be other police services investigating other police. That's what happened. It was a Toronto case, it'd be the OPP. If it was OPP, it'd be Toronto. Often it was contiguous police forces. At the time, as a result of a report by then Claire Lewis, this was deemed to be completely unsatisfactory and led to the birth of the SIU in 1990.
And Shakir, 10 seconds. What do you think would happen if we didn't have the SIU?
I think that the SIU is necessary. I think that's why communities called for it and have continued to call for it to be improved. The question is, what do we do next to make sure it's actually serving the communities that it's supposed to serve?
I feel as if we've just scratched the surface of this conversation. I really appreciate both of you being so generous with your responses.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.